The desert sun hammered down on Ramadi like the fist of an angry god. Commander Ravensteel pressed herself against the crumbling concrete wall. Her breathing controlled her heart rate steady despite the chaos erupting around her. She was 38 years old, but in that moment she felt every second of her 12 years as a Navy SEAL operator. Insurgent fire crackled overhead. Somewhere in the compound behind her, 12 Marines were trapped, pinned down by a coordinated ambush that had turned a routine patrol into a nightmare. The year was 2006, and Ramadi was a meat grinder that chewed up the unprepared and spit out the careless. Steele's team, SEAL Team 5 Charlie Platoon, had been 3 clicks away when the distress call came through. Now they were here, and the Marines were counting on them to do what SEALs do best, the impossible. She glanced at her team, 6 operators battle-hardened and ready. They didn't need words. 12 years of training, of bleeding together, of trusting each other with their lives, had forged a language beyond speech. Steele raised her fist, moved it forward. The signal was clear. They went through that compound like a surgical blade through flesh, room by room, methodical, precise, deadly. When they found the Marines 40 minutes later, bloodied but alive, the young lieutenant in charge looked at Steele with something between disbelief and reverence. "You're the SEAL team," he asked, his voice hoarse. Steele pulled off her helmet. Sweat-soaked hair fell around her face. The lieutenant's eyes widened. "Problem Marine?" she asked. He shook his head quickly. "No, ma'am. No problem at all." That was the thing about combat. It didn't care about assumptions. It didn't care what you thought someone should look like, should be capable of, should be able to do. Combat cared about one thing. Could you execute when the bullets were flying and people were dying? Ravensteel could execute. 12 years later, the desert was behind her, but the lessons remained. Steele stood in the parking lot of the Naval Special Warfare Center in San Diego, California, staring at the building that would be her new battleground. The morning air was cool, touched with salt from the Pacific Ocean just beyond the base perimeter. She traded her combat gear for instructor khakis, but the weight of responsibility felt exactly the same. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "They're going to eat you alive. Hope you're ready." She deleted it without responding. Anonymous warnings were nothing new. Female SEAL operators were rare enough. Female SEAL instructors were practically mythological. Some people couldn't handle the cognitive dissonance. "Commander Steele," she turned. A young petty officer stood at attention, his uniform crisp, his expression carefully neutral. "The colonel is ready for you, ma'am." Steele followed him through the facility. The building was a maze of corridors that smelled like gun oil, sweat, and institutional coffee. Photos lined the walls, generations of SEALs staring out from black and white frames, their eyes carrying the weight of missions, completed teammates, lost promises kept. She recognized some of the faces, had served with a few, had buried others. The petty officer stopped at a door marked Facility Commander, Colonel M. Hartwell, and knocked twice. "Enter," came the voice from inside. Colonel Morgan Hartwell was 62 years old and looked like he'd been carved from granite by someone who'd run out of patience halfway through. His face was all hard angles and weathered lines, the kind of face that came from 3 decades of military service that included 2 tours in the Gulf War, countless black operations nobody talked about, and the kind of decisions that aged a man faster than time ever could. He stood when Steele entered, extending a hand. "Commander, welcome to San Diego." His grip was firm testing. Steele matched it without hesitation. "Thank you, sir. Good to be here." Hartwell gestured to a chair. Steele sat. The office was sparse American flag in the corner, a few commendations on the wall, and a photo on the desk showing a younger Hartwell with what looked like his SEAL team somewhere hot and sandy. "I'll be direct, Commander," Hartwell said, settling into his chair. "You're here because you're the best close-quarters combat instructor we could get. Your record speaks for itself. 12 years operational, 3 Bronze Stars, 2 Silver Stars, more classified commendations than I'm cleared to discuss even in this office." He paused, his eyes locked on hers. "But you should know that not everyone is thrilled about your assignment." Steele's expression didn't change. "Sir, I've spent my entire career being underestimated. I'm comfortable with skepticism." A ghost of a smile touched Hartwell's lips. "I'm sure you are. But these kids, he gestured vaguely toward the training facilities beyond his office. "They're a different kind of challenge. They think they're invincible. Think they know everything because they survived Bodais, or they're the sons of senators, or they've read every Tom Clancy novel ever written. And you want me to remind them what real operators look like," Steele finished. "Exactly." Hartwell leaned forward. "Break through the arrogance. Show them that strength isn't about swagger. It's about skill discipline and the ability to execute when everything's falling apart around you. He pulled a file from his desk drawer and slid it across to her. Your first class, 21 cadets, mixed backgrounds, mixed motivations. Some are here because they want to serve. Some are here because daddy pulled strings and they need a line on their resume. Your job is to figure out which ones have what it takes and which ones are going to get people killed. Steele opened the file. 21 young faces stared back at her from ID photos. Most looked confident. Some looked cocky. A few looked genuinely determined. Her eyes stopped on 3 photos stapled together with a note, "Watch these 3. Garrett Mitchell, age 21, son of Senator Thomas Mitchell from Virginia. The note beneath his photo read, "Entitlement issues, high physical aptitude, low emotional intelligence. Marcus Donnelly, age 20, former college wrestler from Pennsylvania. Note, strength-focused, tends to solve problems with force. Wyatt Callahan, age 22, engineering degree from MIT. Note, brilliant tactically, struggles with interpersonal dynamics. Problem children, Steele asked, looking up. Hartwell shrugged. Potential maybe, or potential disasters. That's for you to determine." He stood signaling the meeting was over. Steele rose as well. "One more thing, Commander," Hartwell said as she reached the door. "These kids think they're hard. They think they've seen it all, done it all. Earned the right to be here. Show them they haven't even scratched the surface." Steele nodded. "Roger that, sir." As she left his office, she allowed herself a small, cold smile. She'd been breaking through assumptions her entire career. What was 21 more Garrett Mitchell sat in the cadet barracks common area holding court like a king, surrounded by his subjects. He was tall, 6'2", with the kind of build that came from personal trainers and college athletics rather than real combat experience. His hair was perfectly styled even at 0530 hours, and his uniform looked like it had been professionally pressed. "I'm telling you," he said, gesturing with a protein shake, "the new CQC instructor is going to be a joke. Some washed-up operator who couldn't hack it in the field anymore." Marcus Donnelly, thick-necked, barrel-chested, with hands that looked like they could crush bowling balls, grunted in agreement. "Heard it's some diversity hire, the brass checking boxes." Wyatt Callahan, seated slightly apart with a tactical manual open in his lap, looked up. "Her record is classified. That usually means something." "Means nothing," Garrett said dismissively. "Probably flew a desk in Kuwait, maybe ran logistics in Qatar. They stamp classified on everything nowadays to make it sound impressive." Around them, other cadets listened with varying degrees of interest. Some looked skeptical of Garrett's assessment. Others nodded along, caught up in the comfortable assumption that they already knew what to expect. "What if she's legitimate?" asked a quieter cadet from the back, a young man named Torres, who'd served 2 years enlisted before applying for officer candidacy. Garrett laughed. "Then we test her? Simple as that." "Test her how?" Marcus asked, leaning forward. Garrett's eyes glinted with something that might have been mischief or might have been cruelty. It was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. "I've got an idea," he said, "and I know a guy in the armory who owes me a favor." The armory technician's name was Corporal Bradley, and he was 42 years old with a mortgage, a messy divorce, and a gambling problem that made him susceptible to bad decisions. When Garrett Mitchell approached him that evening with $300 in cash and a simple request, Bradley's resistance lasted approximately 15 seconds. "Just need a training pistol," Garrett said, sliding the bills across the counter. "For a practical joke. First day stuff. Totally harmless." Bradley knew it wasn't harmless. He knew that lending training weapons to cadets without proper authorization was a violation that could end his career. But he also knew that $300 would cover his portion of this month's rent and maybe, just maybe, give him enough to make a bet on the Lakers game that could turn his luck around. "Training pistol," Bradley repeated slowly. "Blanks only." "Blanks only," Garrett confirmed. Bradley retrieved a 6-hour P226 training model from the secure locker. He grabbed a magazine, loaded it with blank cartridges from the designated container, and handed both across the counter. What Bradley didn't do, what he should have done, what regulations explicitly required him to do, was inspect each round individually before loading. Because if he had, he would have noticed that one of the cartridges in the blank container wasn't a blank at all. It was a live 9mm round, brass-jacketed and lethal, that had somehow ended up mixed with the training ammunition during a range cleanup 2 weeks earlier. But Bradley was thinking about rent, about his gambling debts, about the Lakers' point spread. He wasn't thinking about the fact that he'd just handed a loaded weapon to an arrogant cadet with something to prove. "Due back tomorrow, 1800 hours," Bradley said. And Mitchell, this conversation never happened. Garrett smiled. What conversation? The night before her first class, Raven Steele ran. It was a habit from her SEAL days, 8 miles minimum, often more usually in the dark before dawn. Her body craved the rhythm of it, the meditation of footfall after footfall, breath synchronized with stride, mind cleared by the simple act of movement. San Diego's coastline was beautiful in the pre-dawn darkness. The Pacific whispered against the sand. Distant lights from naval vessels dotted the horizon like grounded stars. The air tasted of salt and possibility. She thought about Ramadi, thought about the Marines she'd pulled out of that compound, thought about the lieutenant's face when he realized his rescuer was a woman, that brief flash of assumption colliding with reality. People made assumptions. It was human nature. The brain looked for patterns, for shortcuts, for ways to categorize the world into manageable pieces. The problem was that assumptions could kill you in combat, could get your teammates killed, could turn a routine operation into a catastrophe. Her job now was to break those assumptions, to show these cadets that what they thought they knew was just the surface, and beneath that surface was an ocean of complexity, danger, and truth they'd never considered. She finished her run as the sun began to paint the eastern sky in shades of orange and gold. Back at her quarters, she showered, dressed, and reviewed her lesson plan for the day. Close quarters combat, the fundamentals, situational awareness, threat assessment, response protocols, and the most important lesson of all, never assume you know what's coming. At 0600 hours exactly, Raven Steele walked into training Bay 4. The space was massive, a converted aircraft hangar, with concrete floors, exposed steel beams crisscrossing overhead, and enough room to house multiple training scenarios simultaneously. Today it had been configured with padded mats, various obstacle course elements, and weapons racks mounted on the walls. 21 cadets stood in formation attempting to look professional. Most succeeded. A few, including Garrett Mitchell and his companions, wore expressions that suggested they were humoring the exercise. Steele placed her duffel bag in the corner and turned to face the class. She said nothing for a long moment, just let her eyes move across each face, reading body language, noting who met her gaze and who looked away, who stood with military bearing and who slouched with civilian casualness. "Good morning," she said finally. Her voice was even, controlled, carrying authority without needing to shout. "I'm Commander Steele. For the next 6 weeks, I'll be teaching you close quarters combat. Not the movie version, not the video game version. The version that keeps you alive when someone is trying very hard to make you dead." A few cadets shifted their weight. Garrett Mitchell's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Today we're going to start with the most important skill in CQC," Steele continued. "Does anyone know what that is?" A cadet near the front, Torres, raised his hand. "Speed, ma'am." "Close. Anyone else?" "Strength," offered Marcus Donnelly. "Common assumption, wrong." Wyatt Callahan spoke without raising his hand. "Situational awareness." Steele nodded. "Correct. Situational awareness means—" She never finished the sentence, because at that moment, Garrett Mitchell emerged from behind her left flank, moving with practiced silence. In his right hand, he held the training pistol, and before Steele could complete her thought, she felt the cold press of metal against her right temple. Marcus Donnelly appeared on her right side, blocking that escape route. Wyatt Callahan materialized on her left, completing the triangle. Around the training bay, the other cadets froze. Some gasped. Others stood paralyzed, unsure if this was part of the curriculum or something else entirely. Garrett pressed the pistol harder against Steele's skull. His voice was loud enough for everyone to hear, confident, performing for an audience. "Looks like the situation just got complicated, ma'am," he said. "Maybe we should talk about awareness now." The silence that followed was absolute. Raven Steele didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't show even the slightest flicker of fear. What she did do, what Garrett Mitchell would replay in his mind for years afterward, trying to understand how he missed it, was smile. It was a cold smile, a dangerous smile. The smile of a predator who'd just watched prey walk into a trap of its own making. "Is that so, cadet?" she asked, her voice dropping to a low, lethal purr. Then she moved. The entire sequence lasted 3 seconds. Second one, Steele's left hand shot upward with speed that seemed impossible for human reflexes. Her fingers closed around Garrett's wrist, not his hand, not the gun, but his wrist at the exact point where the radial nerve ran close to the bone. She applied pressure with her thumb, a technique learned from years of training and refined through actual combat. The pain was instantaneous and overwhelming. Garrett's grip on the pistol loosened involuntarily as every nerve in his hand screamed. Simultaneously, Steele's body pivoted. Her center of gravity shifted with practiced precision, using Garrett's own momentum and weight against him. It was physics and leverage, and 12 years of experience compressed into a single fluid motion. Second two, while still controlling Garrett's wrist, Steele's right elbow snapped backward and across, driving into Marcus Donnelly's floating ribs with calculated force. Not enough to cause permanent damage. She was an instructor, not an executioner, but enough to collapse his diaphragm and steal every molecule of air from his lungs. Marcus folded like a puppet with cut strings, his mouth opening in a silent gasp, his eyes wide with shock. In the same continuous motion, Steele spun Garrett around, using his body as a shield, while simultaneously twisting the pistol from his nerveless fingers. The weapon clattered to the mat. Second three, Wyatt Callahan, to his credit, recognized the situation was deteriorating and tried to intervene. He lunged forward, reaching for Steele's arm. He never made contact. Steele's right leg swept Garrett's feet from under him, sending him crashing to the mat face first. At the same time, she pivoted again, a dancer's grace with a warrior's purpose, and delivered a precise strike to Wyatt's solar plexus with her open palm. The blow was perfectly calibrated, enough force to incapacitate without causing lasting harm. Wyatt's forward momentum stopped dead. He dropped to his knees, gasping, his entire world reduced to the desperate need for oxygen. The training pistol lay on the mat where it had fallen. Steele bent down, picked it up with casual ease, and in a movement so smooth it seemed choreographed, she caught it mid-bounce when it rose slightly from the impact. She checked the chamber, and her expression changed. The cold smile vanished. Her jaw tightened, her eyes narrowed. There, visible in the chamber, was a single brass cartridge. Not the dull gray of a blank round, the bright, unmistakable brass of a live 9mm round. For a heartbeat, Ravensteel felt something she hadn't felt in combat since Ramadi. Not fear, fear was too simple a word. It was a recognition of mortality, of the fact that she'd just been 3 pounds of trigger pressure away from having her brain scattered across the training bay floor. These idiots hadn't known. She could see it in their faces, in their shocked expressions, in the way Garrett was staring up at her from the mat with confusion rather than malice. They'd thought it was blanks, thought it was a prank, thought they were proving some point about female instructors. They'd almost committed murder by accident. Steele's hand closed around the pistol. She ejected the magazine, cleared the chamber, and pocketed the live round with a fluid motion that none of the cadets noticed. They were too busy processing what had just happened, too stunned by the speed and efficiency of their own neutralization. She crouched down, bringing her face level with Garrett Mitchell's. He was still on the mat, his wrist throbbing, his ego shattered, his entire worldview crumbling. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, conversational, which somehow made it more terrifying than if she'd been shouting. Lesson 1, Cadet Mitchell, she said. Never assume. You assumed I was weak because I don't look like your idea of what a SEAL operator should look like. You assumed I'd be intimidated by your little performance. You assumed this, she held up the pistol, was going to prove something. She tapped the barrel against his temple, exactly where he'd pressed it against hers. You assumed wrong, on all counts. She stood, her eyes sweeping across the other cadets. Most looked like they'd just witnessed a car accident. A few looked sick. Torres, the enlisted veteran, looked impressed. Lesson 2, Steele continued, her voice now carrying across the entire training bay. When you point a weapon at someone, even a training weapon, you have just given that person permission to use whatever force is necessary to neutralize the threat. You've declared that the situation is now life or death. You've removed the safety barriers of civilization and rules of engagement. She paused, letting that sink in. Cadet Mitchell and his friends just gave me that permission. They're lucky I'm an instructor and not an enemy combatant, because an enemy wouldn't have stopped at disarming them. An enemy would have used that gun to put rounds through their skulls before they even understood what was happening. The silence was profound. You want to test me? Steele asked the room. You want to see what I'm made of? Fine. Class is in session. What followed was the longest, most grueling hour of physical training most of these cadets had ever experienced. Steele pushed them to their limits and then pushed them further. Burpees until their arms shook. Flutter kicks until their abs cramped. Bear crawls until their shoulders screamed. Mountain climbers until their lungs burned. And through it all, she barely raised her voice. Didn't need to. Her presence, her calm, her absolute confidence, that was enough. By the end of the hour, 21 cadets lay scattered across the training bay floor, soaked in sweat, trembling with exhaustion, and possessed of a newfound respect that bordered on fear. Garrett Mitchell, Marcus Donnelly, and Wyatt Callahan were in the worst shape of all. Not just physically exhausted, but mentally shattered. Everything they'd thought they knew about strength, about dominance, about what made someone qualified, all of it had been dismantled in 3 seconds. Dismissed, Steele said finally. Except you three. She pointed at Garrett, Marcus, and Wyatt. You stay. We're not done yet. The other cadets filed out quickly, grateful to escape. Only Torres looked back once, his expression thoughtful. When the training bay was empty except for Steele and the three young men, she walked to her duffel bag and retrieved a bottle of water. Took a slow drink. Let them wait, let them sweat, let them wonder what punishment was coming. Finally, she turned to face them. Tomorrow morning, CO 700 hours, you three will appear before the base disciplinary board, she said. The charges will be assault on a superior officer, misuse of training equipment, and conduct unbecoming. Garrett's face went white. Ma'am, I'm not finished, cadet. He shut his mouth. The board will almost certainly recommend expulsion. All three of you will likely be dismissed from this program, possibly from military service entirely. Your careers will be over before they begin. Wyatt Callahan spoke, his voice hoarse. Ma'am, we didn't mean it was supposed to be blanks. I know, Steele said quietly. That stopped all three of them. I know you didn't intend to kill me, she continued. I know you thought it was a harmless prank. I know you're stupid, not malicious. She moved closer, studying each of their faces. But that's exactly the problem. You're smart enough to plan something like this, but too stupid to verify what you were doing. In combat, that kind of carelessness gets people killed. Not just you, your entire team. She pulled the live round from her pocket and held it up. The brass caught the overhead lights. This was in the chamber. Did you know that? All three shook their heads, their faces now drained of color. That's what I thought. She pocketed the round again. So here's what's going to happen. I'm going to appear before that board tomorrow. And I'm going to request that instead of expulsion, you three that remain in this program under my direct supervision. Confusion flickered across their faces. Why, Mom? Marcus asked. Because the hardest lessons stick the longest, Steele said. Because I'd rather teach you now when the consequences are controlled than let you learn these lessons in combat where the consequences are body bags. She paused. And because a long time ago someone gave me a second chance when I didn't deserve one. Someone saw potential in me when everyone else saw failure. I'm going to extend that same courtesy to you three. Garrett found his voice. Who did that for you? That's not your concern right now, Steele said. What is your concern is this: if the board accepts my recommendation, you will be subjected to the most intensive, demanding, unforgiving training regimen this facility has ever seen. I will push you past every limit you thought you had. I will break down every assumption you hold about yourselves, about warfare, about what it means to be an operator. She looked each of them in the eye. And when I'm done it, if you survive, you'll be the kind of men who verify their weapons before using them, who never assume, who understand that real strength isn't about intimidation or performance. It's about competence, discipline, and the ability to execute when everything depends on it. Yes, ma'am, all three said in unison. Dismissed. Get some rest. You're going to need it. They left quickly, three young men carrying the weight of their mistake and the unexpected gift of a second chance. Alone in the training bay, Ravensteel pulled out the live round again, turned it over in her fingers, thought about how close she'd come to dying today because of arrogance and assumptions. Her phone buzzed, a text from Colonel Hartwell. Heard about the incident, my office 1800 hours. She pocketed both the round and the phone, grabbed her duffel, and headed for the door. The sun was setting over San Diego, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. In 12 hours, she'd face the disciplinary board. She'd argue for mercy for three cadets who'd nearly killed her. And if the board agreed, when the board agreed, she'd begin the process of transforming them from arrogant children into the kind of operators who deserved to wear the uniform. It was going to be a long 6 weeks. But Ravensteel had faced longer odds in Ramadi, had faced death in a dozen countries whose names remained classified, had faced down assumptions her entire career. 3 cadets, that was easy. That was just another day at the office. She smiled to herself as she walked across the base, the Pacific breeze carrying the scent of salt and possibility. Class was definitely in session. The disciplinary board convened at 0700 hours in a room that smelled like old wood and older judgments. 5 officers sat behind a long table, 3 commanders, 1 captain, and Colonel Morgan Hartwell presiding. Their faces were carved from stone, their expressions revealing nothing. Garrett Mitchell, Marcus Donnelly, and Wyatt Callahan stood at attention in their dress uniforms, spines rigid, eyes forward, trying not to look like men standing before a firing squad. Behind them, several rows of chairs held witnesses and observers. The room felt smaller than it was, the air thick with consequence. Commander Steele sat to the side, her dress whites immaculate, her bearing calm. She'd spent the previous evening in Hartwell's office arguing her case. He'd listened without interruption, his weathered face unreadable. When she'd finished, he'd simply nodded and said, "We'll see what the board decides." Now, watching the three young men try to maintain composure, she felt something unexpected. Not quite sympathy they'd earned this moment through their own stupidity, but perhaps understanding. She'd been young, once cocky, once convinced she knew everything about warfare because she'd read the manuals and passed the tests. Ramadi had taught her differently. Combat didn't grade on a curve. One of the board members, a stern-faced Captain Steele, didn't recognize, read the charges with bureaucratic precision. Assault on a superior officer, misuse of training equipment obtained through unauthorized means, conduct unbecoming of officer candidates. He looked up from the file. "These are serious charges, gentlemen. Career-ending charges." Garrett's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Good, he was learning. "Commander Steele," Hartwell said, his voice cutting through the tension, "you were the victim of this incident. What's your recommendation?" Steele stood, moved to the center of the room. Every eye tracked her movement. "Sir, I recommend that Cadets Mitchell, Donnelly, and Callahan remain in the program under my direct supervision for 6 weeks of intensive training." A murmur rippled through the observers. One of the commanders, a man named Briggs, with a face like a suspicious bulldog, leaned forward. "Commander, these men pulled a weapon on you. Pulled a loaded weapon, even if they didn't know it. You're recommending we reward this behavior?" "No, sir," Steele said evenly. "I'm recommending we use it. They made a catastrophic error in judgment, but it was an error born from ignorance, not malice. They didn't verify their weapon. They made assumptions about capabilities based on appearance. They treated a serious situation like a game." She paused, letting her words settle. "Those are exactly the mistakes that get operators killed in the field. I'd rather they learn that lesson here under controlled circumstances than learn it in combat where the consequences are body bags and flag-draped coffins." Commander Briggs wasn't satisfied. "And what makes you think they deserve a second chance?" Steele met his eyes. "Because someone once gave me one, sir, when I didn't deserve it either." Hartwell's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. A ghost of something memory perhaps flickered across his face. He knew exactly what second chance she meant. They both did. Commander Briggs opened his mouth to press further, but Hartwell raised a hand. "The commander's recommendation stands," Hartwell said firmly. "Her judgment on this matter carries weight." She turned to face the three cadets. "These men made a mistake, a serious one. But they can learn from it, and if they do, they'll be better operators than if this had never happened. They'll verify their weapons. They'll question their assumptions. They'll understand that competence isn't about appearance or performance. It's about preparation and execution." Briggs looked skeptical, but said nothing more. Hartwell surveyed the other board members. Silent communication passed between them, the kind that came from decades of military service and shared understanding. "Very well," Hartwell said finally. "Cadets Mitchell, Donnelly, and Callahan will remain in the program under Commander Steele's direct supervision. 6 weeks of specialized training, subject to weekly review. Any failure to meet standards results in immediate expulsion. Commander Steele, their success or failure reflects on your judgment and your teaching methods." He let that hang in the air. "If they fail, we'll be reviewing whether your approach is appropriate for this facility." "Understood." "Yes, sir," Steele said. "Dismissed." As the room cleared, Hartwell caught Steele's eye. He nodded, once approval or warning. It was hard to tell. Probably both. Outside, Garrett approached her, his face pale. "Ma'am, I need you to understand, we didn't know about the live round. I swear we didn't." "I know," Steele cut him off. "But that's not an excuse. That's the problem. Report to Training Bay 4 at 0400 tomorrow. Bring your gear, bring water, bring whatever God you pray to, because you're going to need all three." She walked away, leaving them standing in the morning sun, three young men who'd just been given a gift they didn't yet understand how to appreciate. They would learn. The hard way was the only way that stuck. Week 1 began in darkness and cold water. At 0400 hours, Garrett, Marcus, and Wyatt stood on a beach north of the base, wearing nothing but shorts and t-shirts, watching the Pacific Ocean roll toward them in dark, massive swells. The water temperature was 58 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to be dangerous. Cold enough to make your body scream. Steele stood on the sand dry, wearing a wetsuit, drinking coffee from a thermos. "In," she said simply. They waded into the ocean. The cold hit like a physical blow, stealing breath, cramping muscles, sending shockwaves through their nervous systems. They pushed deeper until the water was chest high, then stood there shivering, while Steele watched from the shore. 2 hours. She made them stay for 2 hours while the sun slowly rose and painted the sky in shades of orange and gold that would have been beautiful if they could feel anything except the cold. When she finally called them out, they stumbled onto the sand, shaking so hard their teeth clattered, their lips blue, their skin mottled and pale. Hypothermia is a killer, Steele said conversationally as if discussing the weather. Not as dramatic as bullets or explosions, but just as deadly. You need to understand what your body feels like when it's shutting down. Need to recognize the signs, because in combat you might not have the luxury of a warm building nearby. She tossed each of them a towel. Dry off, we've got 12 miles to run. The run was through soft sand with 60-pound rucksacks on their backs. By mile 3, Garrett was questioning every decision he'd made in his life. By mile 6, he was praying for death. By mile 10, he was too exhausted to pray. Marcus vomited twice. Wyatt's engineering mind tried to calculate optimal stride length and energy expenditure, but the numbers dissolved into pain and fatigue. They finished in just under 3 hours. Other cadets were starting their regular training day fresh and clean as Garrett's group staggered past looking like survivors of a shipwreck. Shower, Steele said. Food. Be back at 1300 for combat drills. Garrett wanted to ask if she was serious, wanted to point out that they'd been training for 9 hours already, wanted to collapse onto the ground and sleep for a week. Instead, he said, yes, ma'am, because the alternative was quitting. And quitting meant proving everyone right that he was just a senator's son, playing soldier, that he didn't have what it took, that Commander Steele had wasted her credibility defending him. He wasn't going to give anyone that satisfaction. The days blurred together into an endless cycle of pain and exhaustion. Cold water immersions, pack runs through sand, log PT where they carried a 200-pound telephone pole through obstacle courses until their shoulders screamed and their hands bled. Stress positions held for hours. Sleep deprivation exercises where they stayed awake for 72 hours straight, making tactical decisions while their brains turned to sludge. Through it all, Steele remained calm, controlled, offering no sympathy, but also no cruelty. She pushed them past every limit they thought they had, then pushed further. But she never asked them to do anything she hadn't done herself, hadn't survived, hadn't mastered. Week 2 brought a breaking point. It was 0300 hours. They'd been awake for 48 hours, running drills, doing PT, studying tactical manuals, with eyes that wouldn't focus. Garrett sat in the barracks, his hands shaking from fatigue, trying to memorize close-quarters combat protocols. The words swam on the page. His brain refused to process them. Everything hurt: muscles he didn't know existed, joints that ground like broken machinery, a soul-deep exhaustion that made him understand why sleep deprivation was used as torture. He stood suddenly, the chair scraping loudly in the quiet room. I can't do this, he said to no one in particular. Marcus and Wyatt looked up from their own study materials, their faces haggard. What? Marcus asked. I can't do this, Garrett repeated louder. This is insane. She's trying to kill us. She's punishing us for what? For being idiots for 5 minutes, for making one mistake. We almost killed her, Wyatt said quietly. We didn't know about the live round. That's exactly her point. Wyatt closed his manual. We didn't know because we didn't check. We made assumptions. We treated something serious like a joke. Garrett wanted to argue but couldn't find the energy. He slumped against the wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor. I'm a senator's son, so he said, the words tasting bitter. I could make one phone call and I'd be out to here. Back to comfort. Back to my old life where people respect me because of my name, not because I've earned anything. So make the call, Marcus said, his voice flat. Garrett looked at him, surprised. I'm serious, Marcus continued. If you're going to quit now. Don't wait until we're depending on you in some exercise where your quitting gets us failed too. Don't wait until we've invested more time in someone who isn't committed. The words stung worse than any physical pain Steele had inflicted. I didn't say I was quitting, Garrett protested weakly. Didn't you? Wyatt asked. Because it sounded a lot like quitting to me. Silence filled the barracks. Outside the base was quiet except for the distant sound of waves hitting the shore. She saved our careers, Marcus said finally. The board wanted to expel us. She argued for us, put her own reputation on the line. And yeah, the training is hell. Yeah, it feels like punishment. But maybe that's because we deserve it. Maybe we deserve worse. He walked to where Garrett sat on the floor. I've been thinking about that live round, about how close we came to murder. Not metaphorically, actually, murder. We'd be in Leavenworth right now if she'd died. Our lives would be over. Instead, we're here being given a chance to become something better than we were. Marcus extended a hand. So either take that chance or don't, but decide now because I'm not carrying you anymore. Garrett stared at the offered hand. Thought about his father, the senator who'd pulled strings to get him into this program. Thought about all the times people had dismissed him as just another privileged kid playing dress-up in military uniform. Thought about the look on Steele's face when she checked that chamber and seen the live round, not fear, not anger, but a cold assessment of how close death had come. He took Marcus's hand, let himself be pulled to his feet. No quitting, he said, no quitting. Marcus agreed. Good, Wyatt said, reopening his manual, because we've got 5 more hours before she wants us back on that beach, and I haven't finished memorizing these protocols yet. They studied until dawn 3 young men who'd entered this program as strangers and adversaries, slowly forging something that might eventually become brotherhood. Week 2 ended with a conversation that changed everything. It was evening. The 3 of them had just finished another brutal session, this time practicing weapons retention, while Steele and 2 other instructors tried to disarm them. Garrett had a split lip. Marcus had a black eye. Wyatt's hands were wrapped in tape to cover torn blisters. They were walking back to the barracks when Steele called out, "Mitchell, a moment." Garrett stopped tension flooding his body. Private conversations with Steele usually meant additional punishment or correction. He approached where she stood in the shadow of the training facility. "Ma'am." She studied him for a long moment. In the fading light, her face was hard to read. "Why didn't you report the live round?" Garrett asked suddenly. The question had been eating at him for 2 weeks. "You could have, should have. We'd be in prison. Instead, you kept it quiet." Steele pulled something from her pocket, the brass cartridge. She'd been carrying it this whole time. "You know why this was in the chamber?" she asked. "Armory tech screwed up. Didn't check the magazine properly." "Partially correct, but why were you using a training weapon for unauthorized purposes?" Garrett had no good answer. "You were arrogant," Steele said. "Assumed you knew better than the system. Assumed you could cut corners without consequences. That arrogance almost killed me. In combat, it would have killed your entire team." She held the round up to the light. "I didn't report this because the lesson is worth more than the punishment. You'll carry the weight of what almost happened for the rest of your career. Every time you handle a weapon, you'll remember. Every time you make an assumption, you'll question it. That's a lesson that can't be taught through discipline or expulsion." She pressed the round into his palm, closing his fingers around it. "Keep this. Let it remind you that competence isn't about confidence. It's about verification, preparation, and the humility to know that you don't know everything." Garrett stared at the brass in his hand. It felt impossibly heavy. "I could have killed you," he whispered. "But you didn't. Because I was prepared for assumptions. Because I've spent my career not trusting appearances or expectations. Because I verified the threat and responded appropriately." She turned to walk away, then paused. "Your father's a senator. Probably expects you to follow in his footsteps. Politics, power, influence." "Yes, ma'am." "Is that what you want?" The question hung in the air. Garrett realized he didn't have an answer, hadn't ever really thought about it. His path had always been predetermined: military service for credibility, then politics following the family legacy. "I don't know," he admitted. "Then figure it out. Because if you're here just to check a box on your resume, you're wasting everyone's time, including your own. But if you're here because you actually want to become an operator, want to be the kind of man who can execute when everything depends on it, then keep doing what you're doing." She walked away, leaving him standing in the twilight with a brass round in his hand and questions he'd never asked himself echoing in his mind. Week 3 brought mental warfare. Steele had them training with blanks being fired near their heads close enough to feel the pressure wave, to smell the cordite, to trigger every instinct that screamed danger. The point was stress inoculation, teaching their bodies not to flinch, their minds not to panic, their decision-making to remain clear under pressure. Garrett hated every second. The sound was overwhelming. Each shot made his heart race, his muscles tense, his breath catch. But slowly, incrementally, he adapted. His body learned that the noise wasn't the danger. The danger was losing focus, making mistakes, freezing when action was required. They practiced trust falls from 40-foot towers, falling backward into teammates' arms, learning that operators had to depend on each other absolutely. The first time Garrett hesitated at the edge, looking down at Marcus and Wyatt waiting below. "Jump or quit," Steele called from the ground. "But decide now." He jumped, felt the sickening moment of freefall. Then strong hands caught him, absorbed. His momentum lowered him safely. "Again," Steele ordered. They did it 50 times. each man taking turns falling, catching, learning that trust wasn't a feeling, it was a decision backed by competence and commitment. Week 4 brought new pressure. Colonel Hartwell summoned Steele to his office. When she entered, his expression was grave. "The board is reconvening," he said without preamble. "Some members believe your methods are too extreme. They want the cadets expelled regardless of progress." Steele's stomach dropped, but her face remained neutral. "On what grounds, sir?" "Unnecessary hardship, training that exceeds standard protocols, concerns about physical and mental safety." Hartwell leaned back in his chair. "Commander Briggs is leading the charge. He thinks you're punishing them, not teaching them." "What do you think, sir?" Hartwell was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. "I think you're doing what I did for you 12 years ago, pushing someone past where they think they can go, breaking down assumptions and rebuilding something stronger." He focused on her. "But the board wants proof. Week 6, your 3 cadets will undergo SEER evaluation against instructors I personally select. Full 48-hour field exercise. Escape and evasion against veteran SEAL operators." He let the weight of that settle. "If they succeed, the board accepts that your methods work. If they fail, they're expelled and your teaching approach gets reviewed. Your career will take a hit, Commander." "This goes beyond those 3 cadets now." Steele nodded slowly. "Understood, sir. Who are the instructors?" Hartwell's expression was unreadable. "The best I can find, including myself." Week 5 accelerated into focused preparation. Steele pushed them through every SEER scenario she could design. Escape techniques from zip ties, rope handcuffs, evasion tactics in various terrain, survival skills with minimal equipment. She taught them how to create false trails, how to move without leaving tracks, how to think like prey while maintaining the mindset of predators. "SEER isn't about being stronger or faster," she explained during a night navigation exercise. "It's about being smarter, about using your brain when your body wants to quit, about understanding that the hunter expects you to panic, to make mistakes, to choose the obvious path." She pointed to a ridge in the distance. "The obvious route is over that ridge. Shortest distance. But obvious means predictable. Predictable means captured. You need to think 3 moves ahead. Where would the hunter expect you to go? Where would they set up ambush points? How do you exploit their expectations while achieving your objective?" Wyatt's engineering mind seized on this. He started mapping probability matrices, calculating optimal routes based on terrain analysis and predicted hunter behavior. Garrett and Marcus learned to trust his calculations even when they seemed counterintuitive. They were becoming a team. Not just 3 individuals suffering together, but a cohesive unit that thought collectively, moved synchronously, covered each other's weaknesses. The night before the SEER evaluation, Garrett found himself on the obstacle course at 0200 hours, unable to sleep. The course was dark, silent, filled with shadows and the distant sound of ocean waves. He was running it for perhaps the 100th time when he sensed rather than saw someone watching. Turned to find Steele sitting on one of the wall obstacles, barely visible in the darkness. "Can't sleep?" she asked. "No, ma'am." Nervous about tomorrow, Garrett climbed up to sit beside her. A month ago, he wouldn't have dared. Now something had shifted between them, not friendship exactly, but mutual respect. "Terrified," he admitted. "Good. Fear keeps you sharp. It's overconfidence that kills." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. "I don't deserve this," Garrett said finally. "The second chance, the training. I was an arrogant asshole who almost killed you because I couldn't handle the idea of a female instructor." "You're right," Steele said. "You didn't deserve it. None of you did." She looked at him in the darkness. "But here's what I've learned in 12 years of Operations Deserve has nothing to do with it. People get chances they don't deserve all the time. The question isn't whether you deserve this opportunity. The question is what you do with it. Why did you give it to us?" Steele was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried memories. "My first Buds attempt, I quit on day 3 of Hell Week. I told you that. What I didn't tell you was why I quit." She paused. "I was hypothermic, exhausted, convinced I was going to die if I kept going. But the real reason, the one I didn't want to admit, was that I looked around and saw men who seemed stronger, faster, more capable. I assumed I didn't belong, that I couldn't match them. So I quit. But you came back. 6 months later, applied again, fully expected rejection. Instead, Colonel Hartwell called me into his office. He was a lieutenant colonel then in charge of candidate selection. He looked at me with those eyes that see everything and said, 'You quit because you assumed you weren't good enough. You assumed wrong.'" Steele's voice softened. He told me about his own failures. times he'd assumed things in combat that nearly got people killed, assumptions he'd made about himself that limited him. Then he said failure is only permanent if you stop learning from it. Come back. Show me you learned. So you did. I did. Second attempt, I finished Hell Week. Finished Boo DS. Spent 12 years in combat proving that assumptions about capability based on appearance are worthless. And I learned something else. The people who get second chances often become the best operators because they know what failure tastes like. They understand that competence isn't guaranteed. They verify, they prepare, they never take success for granted. She looked at Garrett directly. You three pulled a gun on me, almost killed me through sheer stupidity, but you weren't malicious, just ignorant, and ignorance can be fixed. Malice can't. Thank you, Garrett said quietly, for seeing the difference. Don't thank me yet. Thank me after you succeed tomorrow. If you succeed. Garrett stood preparing to head back to barracks. Ma'am, one more question. Go ahead. The mentor who gave you that second chance, Colonel Hartwell, is he one of the instructors hunting us tomorrow? Steele smiled in the darkness. Yes. Are you going to give us any advantages? Any hints? No, because he didn't give me any. He just gave me the chance to prove I'd learn. Now I'm giving you the same. Garrett nodded and headed back toward the barracks. Behind him, Steele remained on the obstacle, looking out at the dark Pacific, thinking about second chances and the weight of expectations and the strange circular nature of mentorship. Tomorrow would tell the story. Tomorrow, 3 young men would either prove themselves or fail, and her career would rise or fall with them. She climbed down from the obstacle and walked back to her quarters. There was no point in worrying now. She'd done everything she could, taught them everything she knew, given them tools and techniques, and most importantly, the understanding that competence was built on preparation and humility. The rest was up to them. As she passed the barracks, she could see lights still on in their room. 3 silhouettes visible through the window, hunched over maps and manuals, studying even at this impossible hour. They'd learned something after all. They'd learned that assumptions were the enemy, that preparation was survival. That respect wasn't given, it was earned through sweat and sacrifice and the willingness to push past every limit. Week 6 would prove if they'd learned enough. In 48 hours, they'd either be SEAL candidates or failures. There was no middle ground. There never had been. That was the lesson. That was always the lesson. Steele went to sleep thinking about Ramadi, about the Marines she'd saved, about Lieutenant Colonel Hartwell pulling her aside 12 years ago and giving her words she'd needed to hear. Tomorrow, she'd stand on the other side of that equation. Tomorrow, she'd watch from a distance while her students faced the fire. Tomorrow, they'd either rise or burn. She hoped they'd rise. Believed they would. But hope and belief didn't matter in combat. Only execution mattered. Only results. She closed her eyes and let sleep take her, knowing that in a few short hours, everything would be decided. One way or another. The alarm went off at 130 hours, but none of them were sleeping. Garrett, Marcus, and Wyatt had spent the night in a state somewhere between wakefulness and exhaustion-induced semi-consciousness, checking gear, reviewing maps, running through scenarios in minds that refused to quiet. At 03:45, they dressed in silence. Basic field uniforms. Minimal gear carefully selected and double-checked. Wyatt tested his ankle, still sore from a training injury 2 days prior, but functional. Marcus stretched his shoulder, working out the stiffness from yesterday's climbing drills. Garrett checked the brass round in his pocket one final time, a talisman against assumptions. They met outside the barracks at 0400 hours. No words necessary. After 6 weeks of hell, they developed the kind of wordless communication that comes from shared suffering. Commander Steele was waiting at the transport vehicle, her silhouette dark against the pre-dawn sky. She nodded once as they approached. No encouragement, no warnings, just acknowledgement that the moment had arrived. The drive to the insertion point took 40 minutes. Nobody spoke. The desert landscape passed by in darkness, broken only by occasional headlights from the vehicle behind them carrying Colonel Hartwell and the Hunter Force. When they arrived, Steele pulled Garrett aside for one final moment. "Remember," she said quietly, "this isn't about being the strongest or the fastest. It's about being smart enough to survive when everything's working against you." "Yes, ma'am." "And Mitchell, don't try to be a hero. Be a teammate. That's what I taught you." She stepped back, rejoined the Hunter Force, and became the enemy. The sun hadn't yet broken the horizon when the 3 cadets stood at the insertion point. The air was cold, carrying the sharp bite of early morning desert wind mixed with salt from the distant Pacific. They wore basic field uniforms, carried minimal gear, a compass, 1 bottle of water each, a basic survival kit. Nothing else. Colonel Hartwell stood before them, flanked by 7 other SEAL instructors. These weren't training staff pulled from teaching rotations. These were active operators, men with thousands of hours of combat experience, men who'd hunted actual enemies in actual wars. Their faces were hard professional, revealing nothing. Commander Steele stood apart from the group, arms crossed, expression unreadable. She'd say nothing now. This was their test, not hers. She was just a witness to the outcome. Hartwell's voice cut through the morning silence like a blade. Gentlemen, the rules are simple. 30 miles from here is an extraction point. You have 48 hours to reach it without being captured. We will be hunting you. We have thermal imaging, night vision tracking dogs, vehicles, and 30 years of combined combat experience. He paused, his eyes moving across each of their faces. You have youth training and whatever you learned over the past 6 weeks. If you're captured, you fail. If you reach the extraction point with more than one team member missing, you fail. If you reach it after the 48-hour mark, you fail. Garrett felt his pulse accelerate. Beside him, Marcus's jaw was set determined. Wyatt's eyes were already calculating, processing terrain and probability. Questions? Hartwell asked. No, sir, they answered in unison. Then you have a 10-minute head start. I suggest you use it wisely. Hartwell checked his watch. Your time begins now. They ran. The terrain was brutal, a mixture of rocky desert, scrub brush, and occasional ravines that could hide movement or break ankles with equal efficiency. The first hour was about distance, getting as far from the insertion point as possible before the hunters spread their net. Wyatt let his mind already 3 moves ahead. They'll expect us to head straight for the extraction point. Most direct route. So we go parallel, first establish a false trail, then loop back. That adds miles, Marcus protested. Better than adding capture, Garrett said, trusting Wyatt's reasoning. They moved fast but careful, staying low, using terrain features for cover. Garrett's body screamed from 6 weeks of punishment, but the training had built something deeper than muscle. It had built endurance of will, the ability to keep moving when everything hurt. At the 2-hour mark, they heard the first helicopter. Down, Wyatt hissed. They pressed themselves into a dry wash, covering their bodies with dirt and brush. The helicopter passed overhead, thermal imaging, scanning the ground. But they'd learned about thermal signature reduction, staying in shadows, using terrain to break up their heat patterns, moving slowly to avoid detection. The helicopter circled twice, then moved on. They're sweeping wide, Wyatt said. Standard search pattern. We need to stay in the dead zones between passes. They moved again, faster now, knowing the net was tightening. By hour 6, exhaustion was setting in. The sun had risen hot and merciless. Their single water bottles were already half empty. Every step felt like walking through quicksand. That's when they heard the sound carried across the desert, baying, hunting, closing in, tracking dogs with a scent trail to follow. This was a variable Wyatt hadn't fully calculated for. River, Marcus said, suddenly pointing east. 1/4 mile. We cross water, break the scent. That's the obvious move, Wyatt countered. They'll expect it. You got a better idea? Garrett asked. They looked at each other, 3 young men facing a decision that would determine everything. Trust the obvious solution, or trust that the hunters expected the obvious. Split up, Garrett said suddenly. 2 of us head for the river, create obvious trail. 3rd person goes perpendicular, different direction entirely. Dogs can't track all 3 efficiently. That violates the mission parameters, Wyatt said. We all reach extraction or we fail. We rendezvous later. Grid coordinate. Garrett pulled out the map, calculated quickly. Here, 20 miles from extraction. 12 hours from now. Marcus looked doubtful. Risky. Everything's risky, Garrett said. But together we're one big target. Separated, we're harder to track, harder to capture. The dogs were getting closer. Decision time had run out. Marcus and I take the river, Wyatt said. Garrett, you go north. Create as much confusion as possible. Why me alone? Because you're the senator's son, Marcus said with a slight grin. You're the prize. They'll focus resources on you. We'll slip through while you're drawing attention. Garrett wanted to argue, but the logic was sound. And somewhere in the past 6 weeks, he'd learned that ego was less important than effectiveness. 12 hours, he confirmed. Don't be late. They split. Garrett ran north deliberately, leaving obvious signs, broken branches, disturbed soil, clear footprints in soft ground. He was bait now, and he needed to sell it. Behind him, he could hear the dogs redirecting, following his trail. Good. That meant Marcus and Wyatt had a chance. The next 6 hours were a blur of running, hiding, evading. Twice he came close to capture, once nearly stumbling into a vehicle checkpoint, once almost missing the approach of 2 instructors working a grid pattern on foot. But Steele's training had sharpened his awareness. He noticed things before they became threats, anticipated movements before they happened. He thought about that first day, how arrogant he'd been, how certain that he knew what qualified leadership looked like. Commander Steele had shattered every assumption in 3 seconds and then spent 6 weeks rebuilding him from the ground up. At the 12-hour mark, he reached the rendezvous point, a cluster of rocks near a dried stream bed. He arrived first, found cover, and waited. 30 minutes passed. An hour. Doubt crept in. What if they'd been captured? What if the plan had failed? Then Marcus appeared from the south, moving low and fast. 5 minutes later, Wyatt emerged from the west. They gathered in the rocks, sharing water, checking wounds. Marcus had torn his shoulder on barbed wire crossing a fence. Wyatt's hands were bloody from climbing. Garrett's feet were blistered raw inside his boots. "Status?" Garrett asked. "Dogs followed you," Marcus confirmed. "We crossed the river 3 times, used different exit points, confused the scent trail, made it here clean. Helicopter's been doing regular sweeps," Wyatt added. "Patterns suggest they're concentrating search in a box between here and extraction. We're going to have to go through them, not around them." 18 hours down, 30 hours remaining. 18 miles to go. They rested for 20 minutes, then moved again. Now the real challenge began. The hunters knew the extraction point, knew the timeline. They'd be waiting, watching, ready. As night fell, the temperature dropped. They moved in darkness, using the cold to their advantage. Thermal imaging was less effective when ambient temperature dropped, making human heat signatures slightly less obvious. At hour 24, halfway through the exercise, they encountered the ambush. It was perfectly set, a narrow ravine the only reasonable path forward. 3 instructors positioned at high points with overlapping fields of fire. If they'd been enemies with real weapons, Garrett's team would have been dead before they knew what hit them. But Wyatt spotted the trap. Something about the geometry wasn't right. The ravine was too perfect, too obvious. "Ambush," he whispered. "See the positions?" Garrett and Marcus studied the terrain. Took them 30 seconds, but then they saw it. The slight reflection of optics. The unnatural stillness of brush where wind should have caused movement. "We go over," Marcus said, pointing to a near vertical rock face on the ravine's west side. "That's a 40-foot climb, at night, with no gear," Garrett said. "You got a better idea." They didn't, so they climbed. It was the most terrifying thing Garrett had done in his life. Every handhold was uncertain. Every foothold could give way. In the darkness, he couldn't see the ground below, which was probably a blessing. His muscles screamed. His fingers cramped. Beside him, Marcus and Wyatt struggled with equal intensity. But they'd spent 6 weeks doing trust falls, learning that sometimes you had to commit completely to an action, even when every instinct screamed danger. They climbed because turning back meant capture, failure, the end of everything they'd worked for. 35 minutes later, they crested the ridge above the ambush point, looked down to see the 3 instructors still in position, waiting for prey that would never come. "Commander Steele taught us that," Garrett whispered, allowing himself a moment of satisfaction. "Never take the obvious path. Never assume the enemy is stupid." They moved on, skirting the ambush, heading deeper into the night. Hour 36 brought a crisis. They were 10 miles from extraction, moving through scrubbed terrain when Wyatt misstepped. His ankle twisted in a hidden depression and he went down hard. The sound he made, a sharp inhalation of pain, told Garrett everything he needed to know before Wyatt even spoke. "It's bad," Wyatt said through gritted teeth. "Might be broken. Definitely sprained." Marcus knelt, examined the injury with hands gentle but thorough. "Swelling already. You can't put weight on it." They looked at each other in the darkness. 10 miles to go, 12 hours remaining, 1 team member unable to walk. The old Garrett, the one who'd pulled a gun on Commander Steele 6 weeks ago, would have made a cold calculation. Would have suggested Wyatt stay here, that he and Marcus complete the mission, that 1 failure was better than 3. But that Garrett was gone, burned away by cold water and exhaustion, and the slow understanding that strength wasn't about dominance. It was about commitment to the people beside you. "We carry him," Garrett said simply. "That's insane," Wyatt protested. "You'll never make it. 10 miles, carrying a person, while being hunted. Leave me. Complete the mission." "No," Marcus said, his voice firm. "Commander Steele's first rule, no man left behind." "She also taught that mission, success supersedes individual survival," Wyatt argued. "This is a tactical decision. I'm the heaviest, I'm injured, I'm dead weight. Leave me and succeed. That's the smart play." Garrett crouched down, looked Wyatt in the eyes. "You're right, it is the smart tactical decision. If this were real combat, if the mission objective was genuinely more important than individual survival, maybe we'd make that call. He stood positioned himself to help Wyatt up. But this isn't real combat. This is a test. And the test isn't whether we can reach a point on a map. The test is whether we learned what Commander Steele spent 6 weeks teaching us. That competence isn't just about individual capability. It's about collective commitment. About being the kind of operators who don't abandon teammates because it's inconvenient. Marcus moved to Wyatt's other side. Together they lifted him, positioned him between them in a modified fireman's carry that distributed weight across both their shoulders. "You're both idiots," Wyatt muttered. "Probably," Garrett agreed. "But we're committed idiots. Now shut up and let us carry you." The next 6 miles were agony. Carrying Wyatt's weight while maintaining tactical movement was nearly impossible. They had to stop frequently to rest, to adjust position, to deal with muscle cramps and joint pain. Their pace slowed to a crawl. Every step felt like trying to run through concrete. The hunters were closing in. They could hear vehicles now closer than before. Helicopter passes became more frequent. The net was tightening around the extraction point. At hour 42, 6 hours remaining, and 4 miles to go, they heard voices ahead. 2 instructors, maybe 3, working a search pattern. They were boxed-in voices ahead, terrain behind them, impassable while carrying Wyatt and time running out. "Put me down," Wyatt whispered. "Create a diversion. I'll surrender, draw them off. You two make the extraction." "No," Garrett and Marcus said simultaneously. "Then what's the plan?" Garrett's mind raced, pulling together every lesson from 6 weeks of hell. Steele's voice echoed in his memory. "The hunter expects you to panic, to make mistakes, to choose the obvious path." "We go toward them," Garrett said. "What?" "They're searching outward from the extraction point, expecting us to approach from outside their perimeter. We're already inside that perimeter, so we move toward them, through them, then behind them. They'll be looking the wrong direction." It was insane. It was also the only option that wasn't surrender. They moved forward, painfully slow, carrying Wyatt between them. The voices grew closer. 50 meters? 40? 30. They could see the instructors now. 2 men with night vision and radios working a methodical grid. Any second they'd turn, they'd see it would be over. Marcus stepped on a branch. The snap echoed like a gunshot in the quiet night. Both instructors turned night vision, scanning their direction. Garrett and Marcus froze absolutely motionless. They'd learned this too, that movement attracted eyes, but stillness could be invisible. With Wyatt between them, they must have looked like an odd-shaped rock formation, an irregular shadow, anything but 3 humans trying desperately not to be seen. The instructors stared directly at them for what felt like an eternity. Then one spoke into his radio. "Sector 7 clear, moving to Sector 8. They turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Garrett didn't breathe for another full minute. When he finally exhaled, it came out as a shaky laugh. "That was too close," Marcus whispered. "That was perfect," Wyatt corrected. "You trusted the training, didn't panic. That's how operators survive." They kept moving now, behind the search line, heading toward the extraction point with renewed determination. Hour 47 arrived with the sun beginning to paint the eastern sky. 1 hour remaining. The extraction point was visible now, a clearing marked with a small flag with Colonel Hartwell and Commander Steele standing beside it like sentries. No other instructors were visible, but Garrett knew they were out there watching, waiting for the final approach. This last mile would be the most dangerous. "How do we play this?" Marcus asked, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. Garrett studied the terrain. Open ground around the extraction point. No cover. Anyone approaching would be completely exposed. Slowly, he said, "We walk. No running, no hiding. We've made it this far. We finish with dignity." They emerged from cover, 3 young men who'd started this journey as arrogant children, and somewhere in 47 hours of hell had been forged into something harder. Garrett and Marcus carried Wyatt between them, no longer trying to hide their burden, no longer pretending this had been easy. Other instructors materialized from concealment, 4 more SEAL operators who'd been positioned for that final capture, who'd been waiting for a desperate sprint they could intercept. But the slow, deliberate walk seemed to confuse them. They looked to Hartwell for instruction. Hartwell raised his hand, called off the hunt. The final 100 meters took forever. Every step was deliberate, painful, earned. Garrett's shoulders were screaming. His legs felt like they might collapse. Marcus was in similar condition, sweat pouring down his face despite the morning cold. But they didn't stop, didn't falter. Kept moving with mechanical precision until they reached the flag lowered. Wyatt carefully to the ground and stood at attention before Hartwell and Steele. Hartwell checked his watch. 47 hours, 32 minutes, he announced, within parameters. He looked at Wyatt sitting on the ground, his ankles swollen to nearly twice its normal size. Injured? Hartwell asked. Yes, sir. Approximately hour 36, ankle sprain, possibly fractured. Why didn't your teammates leave you? Wyatt looked up at Garrett and Marcus. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. They said something about commitment, sir, about not abandoning teammates, about proving they learned the lesson. Hartwell's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. He turned to Steele. Commander, your assessment. Steele stepped forward. For 6 weeks, she'd been their tormentor, their teacher, their unforgiving standard. Now she looked at them with something that might have been pride. They succeeded, sir, not just in reaching the extraction point, but in understanding why it mattered. She paused. They chose the hard path when the easy path was available. That's the definition of operator mentality. Hartwell nodded slowly. He surveyed all the instructors who'd been part of the hunt. Gentlemen, you just spent 48 hours trying to capture 3 cadets who 6 weeks ago were the worst kind of arrogant, unprepared, dangerous personnel this facility has seen. 8 veteran SEAL operators against 3 kids with minimal field experience. He let that hang in the air. And they made it through, not because they were lucky, because they were prepared, because someone, he glanced at Steele, taught them that assumptions kill, that competence requires verification, and that real strength is measured in commitment to the team, not individual glory. He walked closer to the 3 cadets, studying each face. This wasn't just about escape and evasion. This was about whether you'd abandon your teammate when carrying him became inconvenient. Old Garrett Mitchell would have made that cold calculation, would have left Callahan to save himself. Hartwell looked directly at Garrett. But you didn't. You carried him. Sacrificed speed for loyalty. Risked failure for principle. That tells me you learned something these past 6 weeks. Yes, sir, Garrett said. Hartwell turned to Steele. They passed Commander. With distinction. Then he walked over to Marcus, who'd collapsed to sit beside Wyatt, completely spent. Good work, son. Your sacrifice play with the Ungs, deliberately drawing attention so your teammates could slip through, that showed tactical thinking and selflessness. To Wyatt, your calculations were solid. The cliff ascent to avoid our ambush was brilliant. And accepting help when you were injured took more strength than trying to tough it out alone. Finally, he returned to Garrett. Mitchell, you coordinated this team through impossible conditions, made smart decisions under pressure. More importantly, you made ethical decisions when unethical ones would have been easier. That's leadership. That's what we need in operators. He stepped back, addressed all 3. You passed. Report to medical for evaluation. Shower, food, sleep. Then we'll discuss your next assignments. As the instructors dispersed, Steele approached. The 3 cadets tried to stand at attention, but their bodies wouldn't cooperate. She waved them down. Stay seated. You've earned it. She looked at each of them for a long moment. 6 weeks ago, you pulled a gun on me. Almost killed me through sheer stupidity. I could have ended your careers. Instead, I chose to teach you something. And we learned, ma'am, Garrett said. Everything you taught us, verification over assumption, preparation over confidence, team over individual, it kept us alive out there. Steele reached into her pocket and pulled out something. 3 pins. The Navy SEAL trident, the iconic eagle clutching an anchor trident and pistol. These aren't real, she said. You haven't earned the actual trident yet. That requires BUDS completion, SEAL qualification training, your first operational deployment. These are training replicas. She handed one to each of them. But consider them a promise, a statement of potential. You've proven you have what it takes to begin that journey. The rest is up to you. Garrett stared at the pin in his hand. The weight of it felt immense, impossibly heavy for such a small object. Thank you, ma'am, he said quietly, for the second chance, for seeing past our stupidity, for pushing us until we became something better. Don't thank me yet, Steele said. Thank me when you graduate BUDS. When you complete your first mission, when you become the operators I know you can be. She turned to leave, then paused. One more thing, the live round from that first day. Garrett pulled it from his pocket. He'd carried it every day, a reminder of his near-fatal assumption. Keep it, Steele said. Let it remind you that competence isn't about never making mistakes. It's about learning from them so thoroughly that you never make the same mistake twice. She walked away, leaving them sitting in the morning sun, 3 young men transformed by 6 weeks of hell into something harder, sharper, better. 4 weeks later, graduation day arrived with perfect California weather. The ceremony was formal, traditional, with families and brass and media covering the event. 21 cadets received their completion certificates. Garrett Mitchell was named honor graduate. Marcus Donnelly received top combat performance. Wyatt Callahan earned the Tactical Excellence Award. But the real moment came after the ceremony, when Garrett found Commander Steele standing alone, watching the Pacific Ocean from a cliff overlooking the base. "Permission to approach, ma'am." She nodded. Garrett walked up beside her, stood at ease. For a long moment, they just watched the waves. "I'm heading to Bud's next month," he said. "Marcus and Wyatt, too. We requested to go through together." "Good. You'll need each other." "Ma'am, I wanted to return something." He pulled out the training pistol from that first day. He'd checked the armory logs, had it officially transferred to him, carried it through graduation as a reminder. "I know about the live round," he said. "I know you kept it quiet to protect us, to teach us instead of punish us. This pistol almost killed you because I was too arrogant to verify what I was doing." He held it out to her. "I want you to have it, as a reminder that your teaching saved my life. Probably will save it again in the future when I'm in actual combat, and the lessons you taught keep me alive." Steele took the pistol, checked the chamber automatically. 12 years of training made verification instinctive. Then looked at him. "Do you know why I really intervened with the board? Why I fought to keep you three in the program? You said someone gave you a second chance. That's part of it, but the real reason—" She paused, choosing words carefully. "I saw myself in you. The arrogance born from never being tested. The assumptions made because you'd never had them shattered. I saw someone who could become an exceptional operator or a catastrophic failure, and which path you took depended entirely on whether someone cared enough to teach you the difference." She handed the pistol back to him. "Keep it, not as a weapon, as a symbol. You'll face moments in combat where assumptions could kill your team, where arrogance could turn a mission into a disaster. When those moments come, remember 3 seconds in a training bay. Remember how fast everything can go wrong. Let that memory keep you sharp." Garrett accepted the pistol, held it with newfound respect. "Colonel Hartwell was your mentor," he said. "The one who gave you a second chance." "Yes. And now you're doing the same for us." Steele smiled slightly. "That's how it works. Someone teaches you. You survive because of what they taught. Then you pass those lessons forward. It's a chain that goes back generations of SEAL operators. Each link is forged in crisis and tempered through teaching." She looked out at the ocean again. 12 years ago, I stood where you're standing now, fresh from failure, given an unexpected second chance, determined to prove I was worth the investment. Colonel Hartwell told me something I'm going to tell you now." She turned to face him fully. "True strength isn't about dominating others. It's about elevating them to heights they never imagined possible. That's the lesson. That's the legacy. That's what it means to be a SEAL." "I'll remember that, ma'am." "Good. Now go. Your family's waiting. Your father flew in from Washington for this." Garrett hesitated. "He still expects me to go into politics after my service. Follow his path." "And what do you want?" It was the same question she'd asked 6 weeks ago. This time Garrett had an answer. "I want to be an operator, a real one. Want to lead teams in combat. Want to be the kind of SEAL who makes his teammates better, who elevates them like you said. Maybe politics later. But first I need to earn the right to lead. Need to prove I can execute when everything depends on it." Steele nodded approval. "Then that's exactly what you should do." 6 months later, Raven Steele stood at the edge of the Buds training compound in Coronado, watching a new class of candidates struggle through Hell Week. The Pacific was cold, merciless, exactly as she remembered it from her own time in that crucible. Among the candidates, she spotted 3 familiar faces: Garrett Mitchell, Marcus Donnelly, and Wyatt Callahan, soaked and freezing, carrying a telephone pole through the surf zone. They looked miserable, exhausted, pushed to their absolute limits, but they were still in it. Still fighting, still demonstrating the resilience and commitment she'd spent 6 weeks building. Colonel Hartwell appeared beside her, his weathered face thoughtful. "Your 3 problem children seem to be holding their own," he observed. "They're not children anymore, sir. They're candidates. And if they make it through, they'll be operators. Because of what you taught them." "Because of what you taught me," Steele corrected. 12 years ago, you stood here with me, struggling through Hell Week, gave me the second chance that made all of this possible. I'm just passing forward what you gave me." Hartwell was quiet for a moment, watching the candidates suffer in the surf. "You know what the real lesson is, Commander, the one that takes a career to understand one." "What's that, sir?" "We're not building warriors, we're building teachers. Every SEAL who survives combat has a responsibility to teach the next generation, to pass forward the lessons learned in blood and sacrifice. That's the legacy. Not the missions completed or the enemies defeated. The students who survive because we cared enough to teach them properly. He looked at her directly. You learned that lesson faster than most. Those 3 kids pulled a gun on you. You turned it into their salvation. That's what great operators do. They transform crisis into opportunity, failure into growth. Down in the surf zone, Garrett Mitchell collapsed under the weight of the log. His teammates immediately moved to support him, refusing to let him fall. An instructor screamed at them, demanding they move faster, push harder. But they didn't abandon him, didn't leave him to fail alone. They carried him through exactly as they'd carried Wyatt through 10 miles of desert. Steele smiled, watching the lessons she'd taught play out in real time. They're going to make it, sir, all 3 of them. I believe you're right, Commander. They stood in comfortable silence, 2 generations of SEAL operators watching the next generation emerge from the crucible. The chain of teaching, continuing link after link, each forged through crisis and tempered by commitment. Garrett Mitchell looked up from the surf, caught sight of Commander Steele watching from the distance. Even through exhaustion and pain, he stood straighter, drew strength from her presence. From the knowledge that someone had invested in him, believed in him, taught him that failure wasn't permanent if you learn from it. He wouldn't quit, couldn't quit. Had too much to prove, not to anyone else but to himself, to the instructor who'd given him a second chance when death would have been justified. The log pressed down on his shoulders. The cold water sucked strength from his muscles. The instructor's voice demanded more, never satisfied, always pushing. But Garrett Mitchell kept moving, kept fighting, kept proving that assumptions could be shattered and rebuilt into something stronger. 6 weeks ago, he'd pulled a gun on Commander Steele because he'd assumed she wasn't qualified to teach him. Now he understood the truth. She'd been teaching him from the moment that pistol touched her temple, teaching him about assumptions, about competence, about the kind of strength that elevates rather than dominates. That lesson had saved his life in the desert, would save it again in combat, would define his entire career as an operator. 3 seconds had changed everything. 3 seconds of controlled violence that demonstrated more about capability than 1,000 words ever could. 3 seconds that taught him never to assume. That was the lesson, would always be the lesson. And somewhere in the distance, Commander Raven Steele watched her students suffer through Hell Week and knew they'd survive. Because she'd taught them how. Because someone had taught her. Because that's what SEAL operators do. They learn, they teach, they pass the torch forward, one generation to the next, forever.